So hi, everybody. I'm Jill Locke, and I'm here to talk about social networks. So I want to just quickly define this for you. And so social networks and how we refer to this are the peer groups to which a particular student belongs. So if you think about your own networks on like Facebook or social media, that's what we're trying to understand at school for children. And so, just to give you a little bit of background, particularly for children with autism, we see some interesting patterns emerge between children with autism compared to their matched controls, which are typically developing students who don't carry an autism diagnosis or classification, I should say. And so the light blue bar are the students with autism. And we see on average, these students are what we would call peripheral. They're peripherally connected to other students in their classroom versus the matched controls, again, students that do not have an autism classification are more often what we would call secondary or average, on average, secondary or very well connected in their classrooms. And so I'll go through what all the different categories mean in a map in just a little bit. But what we wanted to just highlight here is that our students with autism also are secondary and nuclear as well. The nuclear students are the students that are the most popular in the classroom. The isolated students have no connections in the classroom. So you can see that there's, if you draw a line graph or a histogram over this, a bell curve over this, you'll see that on average, our students with autism are peripheral, while their matched controls are secondary. And when we look at these patterns across grade, we see very few differences between kindergarten and first grade, but differences start to emerge between second and third grade and widen at fourth and fifth grade. So this is really important as students kind of graduate in elementary school and enter sort of middle elementary school and upper elementary school to think about how they're included in their social networks. So how do we administer friendship surveys or how do we measure these social networks? So it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. You can either do them individually or in a group format. So if you want to administer individually, you may ask each student to complete the survey individually and support students that obviously have a reading or writing difficulty. You also can do this in a group format. We ask that the students cover their answers as they go. You can read aloud the questions and kind of help progress through the survey that I'll show you in just a little bit. We don't provide any class lists or pictures or rosters for the students because we're trying to capture the saliency of these peer connections and how the networks of inclusion look within the classrooms. So what we need from you, if you were to do this survey, is a roster of the students' first names only. They will complete the friendship survey that way. If more than one student has the same name, just provide the first initial of their last name, and then indicate the grade and the teacher's name so we know how to get this information back to you. So when you are completing the friendship surveys, you should check for completion so that only the first 3 names are circled in a for question 1, I should say, and that only 1 name is starred. You should also check for names listed in question 2 that are friends that don't also appear in question 4, which are the students that are unpreferred or the rejected. And just check to make sure all the demographic information is completed to the best of their ability and that all children listed on the survey really belong to your classroom. So we aren't able to track that once that information is once we leave that classroom, I should say. So this is what the friendship survey looks like. The first 4 questions are asking about friendship nominations, so who the kids prefer to hang out with. It also looks at reciprocity. If kids chose a certain friend, did that friend choose them back? And this question down here asks about rejections. And then number 5 is about the social network. So who the kids see hanging out together in groups. And so we want to look at the peer connections of that and score them in that way. So how we would code, we look at their individual centrality. So that's essentially how many nominations that child received as part of a peer group. We enter it into a co-occurrence matrix like this. These are all names of children on one side. The same names are on the top as well. The red diagonal bars are individual score. So child A1 was nominated twice, child B2 was nominated once, child C3 was nominated twice, child D4 was nominated 6 times. And you can see the highest score is an 8 for this particular time point and for this particular classroom. And this is what their map looks like. So child aid 1 is my student identified with autism. If we were just doing this for all students, we would not have any sort of asterisks or identification marks to show which student's which. And then you can see the individual centrality appears in the parentheses next to the student's ID or their name. And so when we're looking at this, we can see a couple things. We can see their individual centrality. We also can see their cluster centrality, and that's essentially their group score. So how well, who they're connected to, how well do they score, right? So this particular student has an individual nomination of 7. They're connected to a student with a 1, a student with a 4, and another student with a 6. So you take the average of the 2 highest scores, and this becomes a 6.5. That was our student with autism. Here are the isolates, meaning that they were not nominated to join any group. These students here are peripheral. So these are students that are connected by one or few connections individually. Their individual centrality is low, and they're also connected to other students who are individually low as well. These 2 students here and this student here is what we would call secondary student. These are students who are very well adjusted in their social classroom, in their social networks in their classroom. And they are just not the most popular students in the room, who are these students here that are the nuclear students. So individually, they're high. They have an 8, which is the highest score, and group-wise, they're high as well. Whew. Excuse me. So that's what we would score in terms of their cluster centrality. So we're looking at the average of the 2 highest cluster members' scores, and this is how the categorizations go. Remember, the students that are isolated, they're not connected to anybody. They belong to no cluster. The students that are peripheral, the students that are secondary, and the students that are nuclear. And so these are just how we score them. So again, if we're looking at cluster centrality here, this is the what's in the web, the middle of the webs. So these are their cluster centralities for this classroom. And then really important, your social network centrality score can only be as high as your lowest centrality score. So again, the categorizations are here. If you're isolated, you could have any sort of individual centrality, but you really belong to none. So technically, I don't think you're nominated. We have some instances where students are nominated, but the statistical analyses show that they are not nominated significantly to a particular group. So they belong to no cluster. And then peripheral, you can be low, medium, or high, but cluster-wise, you can be low. Individually, you could be low, but you could also have connections that are medium or high and still be considered low, okay? Because you're only as high as your lowest centrality score, either individually or cluster. And then in order to be secondary, you have to be higher or medium or high on either individual or cluster. And then in order to be high, you have to be high on both. In order to be nuclear, you have to be high on both. So this is what a full map looks like, again, in terms of all of these folks that I talked to you about in terms of their classifications. So our student with autism in this case is peripheral, with 2 connections and only connected to one other person. Their score falls in the bottom 30% of their classroom. If you were secondary, you would be in the middle 40%. And if you're nuclear, you'd be in the top 30% of your classroom. And that is all. Thank you.